Well, good morning and welcome to Kings again. My name is Paul. I'm a staff member with Kings, and I'm sorry I can't be with you this morning. I'm sorry you're looking at me on the screen, but unfortunately I have COVID, and therefore I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to come this morning, and so I do apologise. However, it does mean that you can switch off that bit easier for me, so that's okay. Over the last little while, we've been looking at our statement of faith, and after the summer we're going to be looking at again our statement of faith, which is primarily going to be looking at the theology and practice of church life, being in community together. And we're taking time out during the summer to do a mini-series to look at who we are and why we've got to where we are over the last 150 years. Winston Churchill, I think it was Winston Churchill, said that we have to look, the further back we look, the further forward we can project into the future. And so we're going to look at how the charismatic and evangelical world has come to where it's at over the last 150 years. Before I get into what I'm going to talk about this morning, my prayer for you this morning and for the next few weeks is that as we look back at our roots, where we draw water from the wells, which wells we draw from, as we understand our past a little better, bearing in mind that Kings is over 40 years old and we have our own traditions and our own ways of doing things, but we're going to look far, far beyond that point. My prayer is that you will get very excited about church and community as we move into the autumn. Before I get into the main body of my preach, I just want to introduce some books to you. This one is called The Missing Jewel. It's by Les Moir, who's a good friend of mine. And he's looking at charismatic worship in the UK, particularly over the last 40 years. It's a great little resource to read. I also want to introduce this book. This is part of a series. It's called God's Generals, and this is about the revivalists. And it's by a gentleman, American, called Roberts Liardon. It's a warts and all look at revivalists from the 1850s onwards, and it's well worth reading and understanding. Later on in the series, we're going to be looking at Terry Virgo, and I want to introduce this book to you. This is called No Well-Worn Paths. It's the story of New Frontiers, of which we're proudly part of New Frontiers, and you might find that very interesting. It's his personal story, but it also tells the story of New Frontiers, and will particularly tell you how we have particularly got to where we are. Finally, I want to introduce another book to you. This is by Andrew Walker. It's called Restoring the Kingdom. It's the story of the charismatic world in the last 50 years across both America, South America, right across the world really, Western Europe, etc., etc. And it's subtitled The Radical Christianity of the House Church Movement. It's quite technical. It will take some reading. It's a great story, but again, it will help us understand who we are and what we're doing. And I'd recommend them all. They're all in the library down at the hub. So John Wimber, some of you will know who John Wimber is, and we're going to come to him later in the series. But John Wimber said this: historically, every new move of God has produced new music and a new worship style. Let me say that again. Historically, every new move of God has produced new music and a new worship style. The history of the church over the last 400 or 500 years is that we have seen time and time again pairings of people coming together, one preaching the word and one singing the word. That would be true of John and Charles Wesley. John would preach every week, usually in a new place, and Charles would take his notes and he would write a new hymn for that week, sometimes as many as 40 or 50 verses. And we still sing many of them. And we proudly and happily sing John and Charles Wesley's hymns and preaching. Another one to a lesser extent would be Whitfield and Isaac Watts. George Whitfield would go preaching around. Isaac Watts was writing songs at the same time, taking theology in and producing songs, hymns that people who are ignorant, people who couldn't read, people who are uneducated, they would be able to take hold of the songs and use them in their daily worship. The history of the church up to the 1850s was that effectively the church had become very stagnant and very secularized. People were going to church primarily to be seen to be there, not necessarily to worship Jesus. And that might be true for today. Have a think about it. But as we look at the 1850s onwards, we're going to be looking at Dwight Moody and Arya Sankey, which I'm going to do this morning. We're going to move on to the Pentecostal movement and the Redemption Hymnal. We're going to be looking at Billy Graham and his crusades and George Beverly Shea, who was his key worship leader. And then we're going to move into the 1960s and 1970s. We're going to be thinking about people like Arthur Wallace. We're going to be thinking about the Anglican and the Catholic charismatic renewal movement in the 60s and 70s. And then how does that work out in worship with books like Youth Praise and Come Together? New worship leaders like Dave Bilbrough and Noel Richards and others. There's plenty of them. Following that, we're going to be looking at Terry Virgo and the Bible Weeks, particularly in Stoneleigh, and songwriters like Dave Fellingham, Nat Fellingham, Lou Fellingham, Stuart Townend, Paul Oakley, Kate Simmons. The numbers, again, are huge as we look at how those two things combine together. Then we're going to look at John Wimber and the Vineyard and the emergence of New Wine and Soul Survivor and worship leaders like Delirious, Matt Redman and Tim Hughes. And then finally, we're going to be looking at what's going on today. We sing songs from Bethel and Hillsongs and all around the world. The access to songs these days is immense. And we're going to look at that kind of information for why we do what we do today. So that's my introduction. I'm going to start preaching now, so here we go. We're going to start looking, first of all, at Dwight Moody and Arya Sankey. But before we get there, we need to understand, or at least consider, the revivalist meetings in the mid-1850s, 1860s in mid-America, and then subsequently in Europe. Charles Spurgeon, who in the late 1800s had the biggest church in the world in London, he said this: "Many blessings may come to the unconverted in consequence of a revival among Christians, but the revival itself has to do only with those who already possess spiritual life. Revival comes first to the church, and as a consequence of revival in the church, then people who are not yet believers start to believe." Revivalist meetings in the 1850s and 60s was primarily aimed at people who were uneducated, primarily rural settings, but there were lots of things going in the urban settings. People who were working class, people who had an understanding of spirituality, but not really kind of keyed into it. Revivalist meetings were primarily to call the believer to repentance and deeper faith. That was the first point. The second point of a revivalist meeting was that people would respond to a call to sanctification and holiness. Now, we've been talking about consecration recently quite a lot, but sanctification, the process of becoming like Jesus, and holiness, setting ourselves aside for God's purposes. These are the things that the revivalist meetings were primarily thinking about, and that there would be a call to the unbeliever to repentance and faith. Now, bear that in mind as we look at Dwight Moody and Arya Sankey. Dwight Moody was born in 1837 and he died in 1899. He said this of himself: "The world has yet to see what God can do with and for and through and in and by the man who is fully and wholly consecrated to him. I will try my utmost to be that man." He also said this, which I find really difficult. He said, "Faith makes all things possible. Faith makes all things possible. Love makes all things easy." Boy, that's quite a thing to live up to. Dwight was uneducated. He was one of 8 children. He was the 6th born of 8 children. And when his dad died, Dwight was only 4. He went to school at 6. Now, bear in mind, school for him meant Sunday school. It was the only way that many uneducated American poor working class could get an education, is to go to Sunday school, where they would be taught to read and write. But he left at 10. At 13 years old, he met an old man in the street, and the old man told him the gospel, the story of Jesus. Bear in mind, he'd been to Sunday school for 4 years, and he heard this story of Jesus. But he didn't become a Christian until he was 18, and then he responded to the gospel. When he had just become a bootmaker, and he was working in the family business, an uneducated man, couldn't read and couldn't write. And there he was, a bootmaker, just become a Christian. His Sunday school teacher wrote this of him: "I can truly say, and in saying it, I magnify the infinite grace of God as bestowed upon Dwight, that I have seen few persons whose minds were spiritually darker than his was when he came into my Sunday school class. And I think that the committee of the Mount Vernon Church seldom met an applicant for membership more unlikely ever to become a Christian of clear and decided views of gospel truth, still less to fill any extended sphere of public usefulness. Dwight was a bad man." Dwight had a mind who was spiritually darker than most of the people around him. In fact, his Sunday school teacher says of him that he was less likely to fill any extent of public usefulness than any other person he had met. When you consider Dwight El Moody, this man was on the dark side of the moon. However, he became a Christian, and things started to change. He started to tell people about Jesus, and he opened his own Sunday school. Bear in mind, he couldn't read and write, and he only went for 4 years himself. He opened his own Sunday school, and within 4 years, he had 650 children attending. I mean, that's just amazing. Not only that, President Lincoln came to talk to the school because his school was so famous. He couldn't read the Bible stories, but he opened a school. And he persevered to learn to read as much as he could. He was born at a time where the Civil War was just kicking off, and he became a conscientious objector and found work as a chaplain on the front line of the Union Army. And then he found a young lady, Emma Revell, and he started his own family. His Sunday school began to grow and grow, so he moved into inner city Chicago and started a church there, which is where he first met Arya Sankey, but more of that later. Unfortunately, 4 years later, in 1875, there was a huge fire that swept through the whole of Chicago. His church was burnt down. The area that he lived in, his house, his home, his friends' homes, everything got burnt down. And it was just a complete write-off, everything. But he found some new sponsors, and he went back to his hometown in Massachusetts, and he bought some land. And on that land, he retired there to recover from the fire. But he couldn't stop himself. He couldn't stop himself telling people about Jesus. And he began to start Bible summer conferences on his land. He invited evangelists and preachers to come. Even Jonathan Edwards, who some of you may have heard of, came and preached in one of his camp meetings. And he started 2 new schools in the neighborhood. Dwight came to England in 1872, and he preached to large crowds as he brought this new revivalist meeting to the UK. In fact, at one point, he preached to 30,000 people in the open. He visited Scotland and befriended Andrew Bonar, and he then went to preach at Charles Spurgeon's church and the Elephant and Castle in London. And he was travelling around, and on one of his travels, he came to the north of England and he met a vicar who was the vicar of St. John's in Keswick. And a year later, that particular vicar started his first prayer meeting on the grounds of St. John's in Keswick and became what we now call the Keswick Convention. And so even today, we are seeing the outworking of some of Dwight Moody's influence in the UK, still outworking today, less than 10 miles away, and going today even as we speak. He took a little book from Spurgeon, it was called the Wordless Book, and basically the Wordless Book had lots of pages, but each page was just one colour, no words. It was aimed at people who couldn't read the story, and it told the story of the gospel through colour. I remember as a child, people giving me that to look at and to read, and to look at, and telling me the story of Jesus through the Wordless Book. Still going today. He also visited with Arya Sankey again in 1883, and he met a young man called Hudson Taylor and encouraged him to start the China Inland Mission. Dwight Moody was a man of influence. Let's just pause for a second to reconsider. This was an uneducated man, but he started several schools, and in the end, he also started a college called Moody Bible Institute, which still thrives today. Uneducated, but put a huge emphasis on educating other people, particularly the poor and the deprived. He couldn't read and write, but he started 2 publishing houses. Moody Press, named after him, and the Fleming Revell Press, which was named after his wife. And here we have, again, publishing houses that still produce literature today, 150 years on. He was a nobody, but preached to more people on 2 continents than any other person in the last 150 years, person to person, other than Billy Graham and Billy Sunday. And now we have big revivalist meetings all around the world. You look at Reinhard Bonnke in South Africa, who's sadly died now, but his influence and the revivalist meetings continue even today. Let's just consider Arya Sankey. So Arya was born in 1840 and died in 1908. As I said earlier, prior to the mid-1800s, worship was very prescribed, often unaccompanied, sometimes badly accompanied, and often just the choir singing. Sankey was one of 9 children, and he and his family spent evenings around the piano, or the harmonica as it would have been, harmonium, and they would sing hymns together. No television, no books, no entertainment, let's just sing hymns and pray together. And at the age of 8, he went to Sunday school. He also became a Christian when he was 18, but he became a teacher and a choir master. And he was a great singer. In fact, he was so good that other churches around the area and increasingly across America would book him to come and sing in their services so they could hear good music. And it was one of those meetings, the revivalist meetings, he met Dwight El Moody. Somebody recorded this of the meeting between Moody and Sankey. Moody was instantly impressed as Sankey demonstrated his ability to enliven an audience rendered soporific by inactivity and overlong prayers. He did this by giving an impromptu rendering of the hymn, "There is a fountain filled with blood." Meeting Sankey at the end of the session, Moody determined and demanded that the young man should join him in his mission work. He said, "I have been looking for you for the last 8 years." Arya Sankey, by singing one hymn, could enliven people who were asleep spiritually. And Sankey, in the end, said this about them both. He said, "Moody preached and I sang." when they visited England in 1873, Sankey was using what he called human hymns. In other words, there are hymns which are directed directly about and to God. Sankey was also drawing on a new vein of theology, looking at how the gospel impacted me personally. And he began to sing the gospel. Because he was in England, not many people knew the songs. So you do what every singer-songwriter does, you wrote it all down. And he created a short collection of new hymns and songs, and he called it Sankey's Sacred Songs and Solos. You can still buy it today on the internet. He incorporated songs from all over the place and new exciting songwriters and hymn writers like Fanny Crosby, whose songs we sing today, Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine, and all sorts of other people. He collected from some of the older people like Charles Wesley and Isaac Watts, and he produced this new songbook, which some of which was hymns and some of which were songs. There's something really exciting about them because he started to take popular tunes and popular rhythms and themes, musical themes that is, from the theatres and from this various entertainment that was going on, the variety halls and such like. And he would take them and he would rewrite them into hymns so that people who came to the meetings would know the sort of music he was singing so they could apply the hymns, the words, easily to it. And he wasn't alone in that. William Booth, who said, "Why should the devil have all the good music?" William Booth was also doing that. Onward Christian Soldiers is a great example that's come from the song halls of taking the melody and rewriting them for his own purposes. This book, Sacred Songs and Solos, eventually had 1,200 songs in it. Sankey thought that both he and Moody were both preachers, but with different styles. He said this: Moody reaches men's hearts with words that are spoken, the spoken word, while I reach them with words that are sung. God was using a new style of worship to reach into men's hearts and women's hearts. God was taking the music into the heart of their emotions and starting to stir people with good theology so that they could respond to the gospel. So they could be, as I said, they could be called into deeper repentance and deeper faith and sanctification and holiness. Moody and Sankey were using emotion to get into people's hearts and drive the point home. He said this: before I sing, I must feel, and the hymn must be of such kind as I know I can send home what I feel into the hearts of those who listen. His technique for communicating this feeling involved the best possible enunciation, careful use of drama and dramatic effect. You've got to make them hear every word and see every picture, and then you'll get that silence of death, that quiet before God. So Dwight Moody and Arya Sankey, two people who 150 years ago were pioneering a new style of worship, a new style of partnership, a new style of doing things, a new style of meetings, which we still feel the reverberations of 150 years onwards. They were men of faith. There were men who knew disaster in their life. There were men who had knockbacks. There were men who knew what it was like to be scorned and laughed at. But there were also men of faith, men who could see what was going around them. Like I said, inspiring things like Keswick Convention, the China Inland Mission, even the Billy Graham Crusades are a direct result of the revivalist meetings in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. So what is my conclusion then? How can we get excited? Well, there was a new awakening in the USA and in Western Europe around these revivalist meetings. And we are part of that rich history. God was moving the church for later moves of God. The move of God in the 1860s, 70s wasn't just about then, it was about now. God has plans for our future. When things change, God has plans for us and plans for the future for our churches. The new congregational style of worship is born, of which we are benefits of. The use of popular and contemporary styles of music and preaching were introduced in a completely unusual way. And here we are. We use contemporary sounds and contemporary styles to reach out with the gospel, both in word and music. The one point I want to draw on this morning, is that Sankey and Moody created things, and it's so easy to hang on to the past because it was so good. You can still buy sacred songs and hymns. You can still go to revivalist meetings. You can still do all those things, but we must not hang on to the past to the point where we worship it or we revere it. We can't change it. It becomes a sacred cow to us. We must not hold on to the past because God has a better future for us. God was not just moving for the day. He was moving for the day, just not our day. God's moving in new ways today, and we have to grab hold of them. Not without thinking. We must think through why we're doing what we're doing. We don't just get on the first bus that comes along. We must understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. But God has a better future for us than we can even imagine. We must not preserve the past because that would become an enemy of our future. So God bless you. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Have a great day, and we'll see each other soon. Thank you.